Hi everyone, and this is working well, right? You can all hear me. So thank you for attending my talk today, and this being like almost the last talk. On Thursday, I'm Aleksandar Milenkoski. You can refer to me as Alex. I know my name is kind of a mouthful. I work as a senior threat researcher at Sentinel Labs. So Sentinel Labs is basically the threat research department of Sentinel-1. I'm involved mostly in APT or advanced persistent threat research and specialize in malware analysis. At this point, I would also like to thank the wonderful organizers for having me here today. I must say it's a kind of a special pleasure for me because I used to work for NRA Netzwerke, so thank you once again. So that being said, today's talk is structured, I would say, into three main parts. So in the first part, we will discuss some APT or advanced persistent threat actors who are kind of consistently targeting telecommunication providers and who are also within the scope of this talk. In the second part, we will cover some initial infection vectors that these threat actors have used basically to infiltrate environments. In the last part, we will discuss some post-intrusion activities both at a system and at a network level. So when discussing the initial infection vectors and the post-intrusion activities, I will outline some recent trends that we've been observing, mostly with the goal to better equip defenders for defending against these threats. That being said, I will present today summaries of the activities that we have observed, especially over the past year, like since around from the beginning of 2022. So the goal of my talk today is basically to kick off further discussions. So if you have any questions about the activities that I will present, or any similar activities to this, just feel free to approach me afterwards and we can discuss in more details. So starting off with the overview. Now to begin with the most important thing. So why threat actors are basically targeting telcos? So the answer to that is rather obvious. Telecommunication providers are such a strategic asset to threat actors these days, with them being basically the main communication backbones of today's societies as a whole. So threat actors have basically access to three main things that we assess are extremely valuable to threat actors, especially espionage-oriented threat actors. So A, that's data. So telcos usually have very, very large customer bases, which in a way provide a wealth of private information, but also communication data to threat actors. B, it's infrastructure. So telcos usually also have large network infrastructure deployments, which enables threat actors even to target entities that are affiliated with the initially targeted telcos. We have seen such activities as well. And C, it's technology, which I think is rather obvious in this context, right? And I don't have to go that much deep into that aspect. According to our statistics or our observations, I would say that the Chinese, or I would say Chinese speaking would be more correctly, threat actors are among the most prominent threat and the most prevalent threat targeting telecommunication providers. I would say that their attacks amount to more than roughly 80% of all of the incidents that we observe on a regular basis or on a year-span basis. So I'm talking about incidents targeting or related to telecommunication providers, of course. Light Basin is one of the threat actors that we track. So it's a Chinese threat actor, so a suspected Chinese threat actor is the best or the most correct formulation here. That's been active since at least 2016. So these threat actors targets primarily or specialize in targeting, I would say, Linux, Unix, and Solaris environments, which we usually see in mission-critical telco infrastructures. At least in my opinion, what really sets this threat actor apart, at least from the other threat actors that we will discuss today, is their in-depth knowledge in telco protocols and architecture. So this is basically the aspect that brought them into the limelight a couple of years ago through the use of telco-specific malware, I would say. This is an aspect that we can discuss further if you wish. Metador is another threat actor, currently unattributed threat actor, whose activities we first observed back in 2021. So these threat actors target predominantly telcos in the Middle East. I must say attribution for this threat actor in particular has been a real mess for us. And this is mostly because of the different nature of the artifacts that we observed related to this TA. So we are speaking here mostly about, for instance, English pop-punk lyrics embedded in its malware, Spanish artifacts as well, such as, or Spanish/Argentinian artifacts as well, such as the name Mafalda that we observed how they name one of their backdoors, use of very professional, very clean English versus the use also of very informal English, I would say, with the use of smileys, lols, and so on and so forth. Metado is also a very highly OPSEC aware threat actor. This mostly in this context means that this TA used victim-specific infrastructure, so it was very clearly segmented among the targeted victims, and also very, very highly obfuscated malware. WIP26 or Work in Progress 26 is another unattributed threat actor which we first observed towards the beginning of this year. I would say we dated the activities of this TA around July and February, March 2023. So this TA is extremely cloud reliant. So this TA basically used public cloud infrastructure to stage additional malware after initial infection, also to exfiltrate data, but also used public cloud infrastructure for command and control purposes. So this is a topic that I will address a bit deeper towards the end of this talk. In contrast to Metador, this TA has somewhat loose, I would say, OPSEC awareness. So for example, when we were analyzing the network infrastructure of this TA, we observed, for example, that the command and control database of this TA has been exposed to the internet, to the public. So this enabled us basically to dive deeper into it, to analyze the C2 database and establish things like attack timelines, victimology as well, and so on. And finally, Tainted Love. So Tainted Love, again, is a Chinese threat actor that we assess is somewhere in the nexus of APT Gallium and APT 41. So we first spotted this threat actor also around February and March 2023, so a couple of months ago. We identified basically a credential theft malware that we associated initially with Operation Soft Cell, which is conducted by APT Gallium. So for those who may not know, Operation Soft Cell was an operation targeting telecommunication providers, mostly in the Middle East, in the time period between 2019, I believe, around 2021. So as I mentioned, this credential theft malware that we observed was actually a newer version of another credential theft malware, which was basically signed with a code signing certificate that is known in the threat intel community to be used by APT 41, which is yet another Chinese Nexus TA. So that somehow leads us to our assessment that we are dealing with a TA here that is somewhere in the nexus of APT Gallium and APT 41. The possibility of what we call digital quartermaster among the Chinese espionage threat actors is very high. So this is yet another research topic that I'm involved in. So I invite you, if you have more interest into this, just speak to me. We can cover that aspect in more detail after the talk. But basically, this case, the Tainted Love threat actor is one of the prime example, in my opinion, about the existence of a central digital quartermaster among the Chinese threat actors. So starting with the initial infection vector. So in this part of the talk, we will first focus on how threat actors are leveraging and have been leveraging instant messaging platforms for initial access. So in a time, I would say, in an era where digital identity basically has never been more critical, SIM swapping attacks and push notification spams are definitely on the rise. What's relevant here is that TAs can abuse this not only to compromise credentials in a way of a multi-factor authentication bypass, but also to masquerade as trusted contacts of certain individuals that they target. And this is exactly a case that we will discuss briefly today. We will also focus briefly or discuss briefly a vulnerability exploitation case. I would say here, whether it's Zimbra, Zoho recently, or any other zero-day really, we still see vulnerability exploitation in a way as a constant threat against telecommunication providers in any case. And finally, we will discuss how threat actors, especially again Chinese threat actors, are conducting long-term attacks in an attempt to evade detection, right? So as I mentioned, this is a very common MO, kind of a modus operandi for the Chinese Nexus threat actors who we have observed and who are also known in the broader community to conduct even year-long attacks for this purpose. So in the context of Work in Progress 26, that's basically our moniker for unattributed threat actors. The initial infection vector, so let me know, can you see the cursor? Cool. So the initial infection vector involves sending WhatsApp messages to employees of telecommunication providers. Now these WhatsApp messages contained a malware loader, which we will discuss a bit later on, and that deployed two BigDoor variants, CMD365, which basically abused Microsoft 365 infrastructure for command and control purposes, and CMD Ember, we named it because it abused a Google Firebase database for command and control purposes. So the threat actors also abused Microsoft Azure infrastructure, both to exfiltrate data and also to stage additional malware. So this whole operation was pretty much kind of a cloud-centric, public cloud-centric operation. We strongly suspect, we are still investigating, but we strongly suspect that the TAs might have used SIM swapping attacks, as I mentioned earlier, basically to masquerade as trusted contacts of the targeted employees. In the context of light basin, so we first observe, or it's better to say, I would say we first dated the initial attack activities in this particular context for this particular target in around back in 2018, when they have exploited, or we suspect they have exploited, a dense zero-day in an internet-facing Veritas cluster service. So the Veritas cluster service is, I would say, kind of a high availability engine, high availability system that in a way provides redundancies of system and in that way eliminates a single point of failures. It is interesting to note here that we suspect that the Veritas cloud service has been left exposed to the internet due to an operational mistake. And this is something, kind of a fact that the threat actors immediately spotted, they noticed this and immediately took advantage of it. After initial infection, the TS deployed the Sun4Me malware. Now the Sun4Me malware is a very, very capable malware, and they use it to basically enable further operations. We will discuss in a second the overall timeline of this attack activity. So the Sun4Me malware implements, for instance, reconnaissance capabilities, exploitation capabilities as well, and also file exfiltration capabilities, which in this context the TAs have also used to exfiltrate credential-related files for further compromise. We kind of plan to soon release more details about the concrete Sun4Me implementation that we observed in the context of this activity, but again, if you have some interest about more details, we can speak more after this talk. So as I mentioned earlier, TS, especially Chinese Nexus threat actors, tend to conduct very long-term attack activities in an attempt to evade detection. So in the context of Tainted Love, we first observed their activities, I would say, around July 2022, when they established initial access and also conducted reconnaissance at that point. And what they did afterwards, they just left the environment, no further activity at all. And they came back in early February 2023. So this is almost like almost 7 months apart. At that point, they deployed a new version of a web shell that is for remote command execution, of course, and again left the environment and made a break of around 2 months, which brings us to late February 2023, when they did again reconnaissance and credential theft. So we will discuss their credential theft capability in this talk in greater detail. So the overall timeline of this activity was around 8-ish, 9 months. In the context of Light Basin, the scenario is much more extreme, I would say. As I mentioned earlier, we dated basically their first attack activities back in July 2018, when they have established initial access. And their overall attack activity lasted till January 2023. So with them basically conducting a variety of activities along the way. So this involves things like backdoor deployment. Of course, they're a bit more mixed, but I'm kind of emphasizing here in a way the activities that were more prevalent in a given time period, right? So we had backdoor deployment, establishing of proxy communication channel as well, privilege escalations along the way, of course, and reconnaissance now and then. So they were basically continuously re-enumerating, continuously remapping the targeted environment, and what's most important, adapting their tactics and techniques along the way. So the overall lifespan of this activity was around, like whooping, I would say 4.5, almost 5 years. So this was a pretty extreme case and kind of an example of the point that I mentioned before, that the Chinese TAs, especially them, they tend to do this a lot. What are some takeaways? What can we conclude from this in a nutshell? So first, I would say, of course, one must treat instant messaging as a very valid and a very dangerous initial intrusion vector. As I mentioned earlier, in a time where digital identity has never been more critical, as you all know, second factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is definitely a must, but it is important to reiterate now and then that it is definitely not bulletproof. We are observing a lot of threat actors, not only the Chinese and not only espionage threat actors, but also cyber criminal groups conducting a lot of SIM swapping attacks, push notifications, spams and whatnot. One prominent case was recently with the Lapsus group, which used to do this a lot recently. So we therefore, in general, recommend the adoption of what we call attack-resilient MFA, of course, like biometrics, in favor of rather legacy MFA techniques like OTPs, like one-time password, SMS, and push notifications, and so on. In my opinion, it is also very important, especially for telecommunication providers, to develop capabilities for clustering threat activities over mid and long-term periods. So this is crucial and very important for the detection of these activities, but also for remediation against kind of a long-standing, long-term threats, such was the case with Tainted Love and Light Basin. And of course, a very old message, but I had to mention it, make patching a priority, control the attack surface. Just to remind, Light Basin basically exploited a zero-day vulnerability once they spotted that a vulnerable version of the Veritas class service has been made available to the internet, so they tend to monitor the environment and abuse any possibility at any point in time to get and establish initial access, right? So these 2 points are very, very, very important and sadly often overlooked in practice, and especially in large environments, which is of course kind of also a practical issue, but still has to be mentioned. Continuing with post-intrusion activities at a system level. So as a general trend, I would say, with the proliferation of XDR systems, and not only of XDR systems as we understand it, but of detection mechanisms in general, we see more and more threat actors turning to abuse of LOL bins and evasion of detection mechanisms in the attack campaigns. not only of XDRs, but also even of system-native monitoring capabilities, such as the event log in Windows context and other system-native monitoring tools. In a summary, LOL bins represent a way for threat actors to conduct malicious activities using system-native tools, again with the hope of remaining undetected. So just very recently we, and by we I mean the overall security community, observed a huge Volt typhoon. That's another Chinese TA incident that was basically a LOL bin, almost a LOL bin only operation, like full-blown espionage operation based on only LOLBin. One of the most interesting LOLBin cases we observed was in the context of Metador. So in this case, the TAs executed a CDB.exe executable, which is part of the window debugging toolkit, to inject a debugging script, which was called CDB.ini, into the legitimate Windows process defrag.exe. So CDB.ini was not a debugging script. It was actually a malware loader, which ultimately led to the deployment of a BigDoor, which was implemented in fcache13 DB file. So just to present the bigger picture here, how the overall initial infection looked like. As I mentioned earlier, so I will just try to follow with the cursor. So the threat actor first executed CDB.exe, which injected CDB.ini inside the defrag.exe process. So the malware loader actually loaded and executed another backdoor, another implant, which we called MetaMain, which in turn reflectively loaded and executed the Mafalda backdoor, which I mentioned earlier in the introduction. So we named this backdoor Mafalda basically based on internal string references. So the Mafalda backdoor was the entity that was responsible for talking to the C2 server, to the communication and control server, and implemented 3 ways to do that: over TCP, over HTTP, and over named pipes, even for local process communication. To establish persistence, the threat actors abused Windows Management Infrastructure, or WMI event subscription, to basically execute CDB.exe at every system reboot, basically kicking off this whole chain that I just presented here. Metador also invested a lot in anti-detection and OPSEC. So its Mafalda backdoor enumerated in total 36 detection mechanisms, so security solutions, or if we go and to count individual files, in total 404 individual files. So they invested a lot of effort into this. As you can see in the table here, it's composed basically of internal Mafalda strings, of internal string references. This includes almost all of the major security vendors at this time. What's interesting to note is that Mafalda, or the threat actors, also enumerated analysis tools. You can recognize some of them, like the SIS internal suite, Wireshark, network sniffers, debuggers even, x64, DBG, OLE debugger, and whatnot, IDAPRO as well. We believe that this was in an attempt basically to enumerate and to detect malware analyst machines. In the context of Tainted Love, so I'm just kind of switching you between the TS all the time, but the other points are what is more important here. So in the context of Tainted Love, as I said, we observed a credential theft capability, which we named MIM221. So MIM221 comes basically as a combination of Mimikatz, as a well-known credential theft tool, and 221 was actually the version of this tooling that we observed as specified in the malware itself. So MIM221 was focusing heavily on anti-detection. We are talking here about evading system-native monitoring capabilities, which I referred to before. So we had here, for example, in-memory image mapping, which involves loading and executing of code fully in memory without touching the disk. So the credential theft capability did this basically, of course, to evade file-based detection. We also had terminating event log threats, however, without terminating the event log service itself. So the event log service is responsible for managing Windows logs, basically. So the credential theft capability did this to evade detection based on service manipulation. And finally, we had a staging of a credential theft capability in the LSASS process, itself. As you know, the LSASS process is responsible for managing Windows credentials. So this credential theft tool did it basically to evade detection of credential dumping of a process that is external to LSASS itself. We can discuss the concrete flow of this tool a bit later because I still have quite a few slides to go through, considering the time that I have left. In the context of Light Basin, so we did not see that much XDR evasion efforts. We saw more generic OPSEC practices. This may be due to the fact that we just speculate here that XDR systems or third-party security solutions are still not that prevalent in our view among Linux environments. So we saw things like conditional malware execution based on environment variables. One thing to note here is that the threat actors may have been doing this also to deconflict with other TAs that may have been present in the environment. So it's very important to note here that telco infrastructures can be heavily contested environments between multiple threat actor groups at the same time. And other typical stuff such as binary encryption and a series of anti-forensic tactics such as time stomping and log deletion that we observed along the whole attack chain and activities that I depicted before. What can we learn from these activities? First, it's important to develop a low-bin protection strategy, of course. This can be done using application execution restriction mechanisms such as Windows Defender application control or use of any system for monitoring low-bin activity. If your organization runs an XDR system or any type of a third-party monitoring tool, I would say make sure to evaluate and monitor the active system driver landscape. And why I'm saying this, because we observe that threat actors, if they spot that an XDR is running or any other type of third-party detection utility, they tend to use legitimate and cite, however, vulnerable drivers that allows them to execute malicious code with kernel privileges, right? Usually they do this to terminate any process, and usually they focus on, I don't know, XDR processes or any other type of processes that are related to detection. One thing to know that these kind of tools, such as Backstep, are also very prevalent on the black market as well. So it's not only espionage threat actors that are doing this, but recently cyber criminal TAs are doing it as well. The recently announced low drivers projects, for instance, it's a great thing. So they maintain basically a list of such vulnerable drivers to keep the community always up to date. So we continue with the last part of the talk with post-intrusion activities at a network level. I would say from around 2022, we are observing more and more threat actors that are turning to abuse of public cloud infrastructure, either for command and control purposes or to host malware for delivery at victim machines. So we have, for instance, the North Korean APT37, which abused the Microsoft Graph API and 365mail, that's the online email service of Microsoft. Also Indian groups such as the Do Not group, they abused Google Firebase Cloud messaging similar to WIP26, what I presented before. It's not only espionage threat actors, but also cybercriminal threat actors. So for example, we recently observed the debug loader operators abusing OneDrive and Google Drive to host malware. And also Brazilian cybercrime groups. So these Brazilian cybercrime groups were basically targeting mostly Portuguese and Spanish users of financial institutions. So they were targeting the banking sector. So the threat actors are using public cloud infra to blend in malicious traffic among legitimate traffic, but also for flexibility, meaning that if defenders decide in a way to block the communication to a given cloud instance, threat actors can easily provision a new one. It is important to note here that abuse of public cloud infrastructure is kind of a double-edged sword for TAs. While it offers them certain advantages, it's important to know that the big cloud vendors also have visibility into their activities. So the TAs, in a way, would have to sacrifice a little bit on their OPSEC in order to gain the advantages that the abuse of public cloud infrastructure offers to them. So in the context of WIP26, as I mentioned before, the initial infection vector involved sending of WhatsApp messages that distributed a malware loader. So the malware loader, just to reiterate, deployed two backdoor variants. One was CMD365, which abused 365 mail, and CMD Ember, which abused Google Firebase database for command and control. So the malware loader was signed using an invalid Wondershare certificate and was the entity that was responsible for establishing persistence through a scheduled task. So how CMD365 works, the backdoor first logs into microsoftonline.com and provides a client ID and a client secret. So we are still investigating whether the threat actor used compromised credentials or self-registered credentials at this point. Afterwards, the backdoor creates a mail folder which acts as a victim-specific location for storing commands that the threat actor has provided for execution at the victim machine, but also for storing command output. Then the backdoor continuously was polling for commands, and how we did it, it was filtering for email messages whose subjects start with the word input. So this is how the TAs were basically specifying commands for executing at victim machines. And once a command becomes available in the victim-specific email inbox, then the backdoor basically takes the command and pipes it into the standard Windows command utility, acting effectively as a remote command execution tool. How CMD Ember works, the Google Firebase counterpart basically of CMD365, in a way very similar to CMD365, but with a major difference that it was abusing a Google Firebase database for command and control. So in order to poll for commands, this backdoor was basically querying a Google Firebase database by using a victim-specific key. So in a way, same to the CMD365, was an entry in the database appears, then the backdoor basically pipes the command into the Windows command utility. So the backdoors and the command and control server exchange JSON formatted messages, where the field who in a way indicates the communication direction. So if who is set to server, then the data field contains a command, distributed either through the Google Firebase database or through an Outlook inbox. If who is set to client, then it's the other way around. The data field contains a command output, and in this way, the TAs basically achieved remote command execution, which is an initial beachhead basically, and then they continued based on this with all other further activities. So finally, I would say when it comes to defending against of public cloud infrastructure, usually we recommend a two-phased approach. So the first phase involves restricting the cloud services that are reachable from your environments. This is to reduce the overall monitoring service, that is the overall network data and flow that you would have to monitor, of course, but also the attack service that threat actors may abuse. The second phase is about actually monitoring for anomalous cloud traffic. I must say here, we see here usually organizations struggling with the sheer scale and volume of the traffic that they have to monitor and observe, and especially for large organizations that tend to use for example, the Google online services or Microsoft online services and so on. So that is where the first phase is basically critical to the extent that it is feasible, of course. Organizations also struggle with dynamicity of cloud instances, especially when it comes to defense. As I mentioned before, if defenders decide to block a given cloud instance, the communication to a given cloud instance, threat actors tend and can easily provision a new one and adapt their attack tactics. So in that way, blocking known IOCs such as URLs or specific names of cloud instances may not always work, and that is the biggest trouble that we have with this kind of attack activities. So that being said, I would like to thank you for your attention. Again, if you have any questions, I'm here now and I'm here after the talk. We can discuss more. Thanks a lot.